Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So the topic of today's video essay is about the Buddhist philosopher Nāgārjuna, who wrote around the first or second century of the Common Era and is sort of the foundational patriarch of the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist thought. And so what I would like to do today is just actually go very carefully through a couple of verses from his root text, the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, and just to talk a little bit about these verses and what they mean and why understanding them can help us also further understand what makes Nāgārjuna idiosyncratic and interesting as a Buddhist philosopher. And there are, many ways to answer that particular question. Nāgārjuna is often regarded as something of the second Buddha. He's probably the most revered Buddhist philosopher after the Buddha himself. So, he needs no justification for serious treatment. But what I want to do is focus on some verses from the 18th chapter of the book, which is ostensibly about the self, but even that's a little misleading because most of the chapters that precede it in the text are also interested in the self and its negation and the world in which the self finds itself situated. So chapter 18 sort of brings all of those thoughts together and starts to think about what it means for Buddhist philosophers to negate the self and how that's related to their soteriological aims, to their aims in achieving existential freedom, liberation from suffering or dukkha. Now, and here's where, and that's universal, okay? So Indian Buddhist philosophers are mostly agreed that there's no such thing as an Atman, and that realization of that is a constitutive part of the path of realization that leads out of samsara conditioning and into a liberated state. But for a lot of Buddhist philosophers, the denial of the substantial existence of an unchanging self, excuse me, I'm still getting over my COVID cough. It's not just a metaphysical posit, right? It's a move that is core to the system's concerns with freedom. So Nāgārjuna's approach to this particular connection between claiming that the self is empty of svabhava, that it has no substance, and liberation from suffering consists of a truly novel and philosophically interesting interpretation of the Buddha's teachings. So, for example, Abhidharmic teachings, the negation of self is anchored in a mereological reduction. That is, what you think of as a single thing is really just a plurality of highly integrated things. And when you realize the mereological relation, when you realize there is no one thing, there is no you, there's just an integrated and organized plurality, organized in a you-like fashion, you get to experience detachment from that self, release from it, and transcendence. For Nāgārjuna, there is no irreducible reduction base, right? So even the dharmas, these little momentary events, have no substance. They don't really exist. They only have a conventional form of existence. They're just a way of talking and a way of carving up our experience for to achieve certain ends. And so for Nāgārjuna, what it means to really eradicate suffering is slightly different from what we might have seen already. Now, what I want to do here is just read a very important verse. This is verse 5 of chapter 18, and it's on page 197 of this translation from Siddharitz and Katsura, their edition of the Sanskrit, English edition of the Sanskrit of Nāgārjuna. So here's the verse. It says, liberation is attained through the destruction of actions and defilements. So liberation is moksha, and actions and defilements are karma, klesha. Karma, action, klesha, defilements. Actions and defilements, karmas and kleshas, arise because of falsifying conceptualizations, vikalpa. So we see here that the way we think about things, the way we organize things, is having an impact over our samsaric continuity, over the actions we take and over the defilements we carry with us that motivate those actions and keep us bound in a conditioned state. And finally, most importantly, those falsifying conceptualizations, vikalpas, those arise from prapancha. Now, Sideritz and Katsura translate this word prapancha as hypostatization, which is a weird word, means reification, the rendering static and still of something. I don't like this translation because it sort of glosses over a very important semantic dimension of this term that is absolutely central to understanding its functional role in Buddhist philosophy, especially in Nāgārjuna's Buddhist philosophy, but also in the earlier Pali suttas where this term first finds its deepest articulation, actually. And one of the interesting things about prapancha from a historical perspective is that it gets its fullest theoretical development in the suttas. Actually, the Abhidharmikas don't really touch it, not with the level of precision and consistency that we see in some of these suttas. And for Nāgārjuna, it's absolutely central, but again, it's sort of implied. So the differences there are really important and historically interesting. I probably won't have time to unpack them too much, but I'll say something about it as I go. But from Vikalpa's conceptual distinctions, falsifying conceptualizations arise from prapancha, and prapancha is extinguished, nirudyate, in emptiness, shunyata. So we have a hierarchy here, and we start with something obvious that most Buddhists would agree with, and we end with something kind of idiosyncratic and interesting. So karma and klesha are those actions and defilements. These are explicitly problematic behaviors and mental events that keep us bounded in samsara. Now, vikalpa, for Mahayana philosophy, not just Nāgārjuna and Madhyamaka, but also for Yogacara, the idea that our conceptualization is a core cause of our problem is true for them across the board, right? And so vikalpa, falsifying conceptualizations, are thoughts which refer to the self as I and the world as mine, right? It is the organization of experience according to ownership of a falsely constructed self, and ownership of a world organized according to the needs and desires of myself. Now, where does that come from? How is it that we're able to project ownership? Well, through prapancha, right? Prapancha is a kind of, in the Pali term papancha, without the R, was translated by others as proliferation or conceptual proliferation. And this is why hypostatization is not the best translation for this term. Basically, what's going on in prapancha is that we're kind of projecting onto the world a set of distinctions, which then set us up to really own those distinctions. So the distinction between grasper and grasped, between self and world. And once I have a basic set of distinctions in the world that I projected onto it, I can then own certain parts of the world, and I can own myself, and I can cling, okay? Now, what's important here, I think, to understand about prapancha is that it has two dimensions. The dimension of hypostatization, or reification, is accurate, right? That is a core semantic component of what this term is talking about. But there's another one that I would call the proliferation side. And the way to understand this term, the example I like to use to explain it, actually comes from Harry Potter. So I'm assuming that most of us are familiar with Harry Potter and have hopefully read or seen the movies. I'm going to spoil the 7th film a little bit. So in the 7th book, I guess the book was split into 2 movies. Doesn't matter. But in the last book of the series, there's this scene where the intrepid explorers and heroes have to go to the Gringotts Bank and descend into a vault that is owned by one of the Death Eaters to retrieve the cup, the chalice of Helga Hufflepuff, because Lord Voldemort has turned the chalice into a Horcrux. And what happens is when they get their hands on this cup, 2 things happen. One, it starts to burn them, and it starts to multiply. And there's this scene in the book where the cups keep multiplying, because every time the cup is touched, it multiplies. And so as it multiplies, you keep touching it because there's more of them, and then they keep multiplying and burning you. This is what prapancha is, right? Prapancha is the multiplication and projection, the proliferation of a category schema onto reality that then reifies reality according to the dimensions of those categories, and then impresses itself back upon you as reality. So it's a projection that then gets bounced back to us in a way that makes us think, it makes it seem to us like what we're really perceiving is just what's out there in the world, but really what we're perceiving is a kind of self-perpetuating user illusion. And once that user illusion is up and running in the system, and we're projecting in a consistent way, and we're doing it in concert with other people, and we have this kind of socio-linguistic life world that we're living in, then we can start vikalpaing, as it were. We can start owning and really saying, this is mine, and this is me, and this is what I want, and this is what you did, and boom, 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 and then we're off to the races. And once we have that I, me, mine projection, like dichotomy anchored into the prapancha world, then we are acting and defiling, and we've got karma klesha. So for Nāgārjuna, it is this progression of reification and ownership that ossifies the mind and is the primary source of suffering. So much so that if you go back in this text to the dedicatory verse, Nāgārjuna says that he identifies the cessation of suffering with the cessation of prapancha. And so does Chandrakirti, actually, in his commentary in chapter 18. So the question of how to undo this progression is one of skillful means, upaya. But what's really interesting about this for me is that if you compare this analysis to the way this term is deployed in the Pali literature, in the Pali literature, we see this term as a kind of emergent kind. We see prapancha as something particular to human adult, like higher level sociolinguistic humans. And it's something that emerges as a kind of higher order trap that we fall into. It's what happens when we basically really start talking to ourselves in our head and believing what we say. And so in this way, it really is characterized as an emergent phenomena that is parasitic on more primordial forms of craving and ignorance, which are the core causes of suffering. But in Nāgārjuna, we see this term, this idea, this notion really kind of anchored as the foundational problem. And that's an important distinction, because it tells us something about Nāgārjuna's philosophical and soteriological motivations, namely that he sees our enmeshment in the socio-cultural linguistic world as something we're kind of always already in. And that means we can't think of our conceptual enmeshment and our projection as something that we grow into, even though we do. It is the core phenomenon that anchors our sense of ownership and our afflictions and actions, our karmic continuity. So that's really interesting and distinct contribution that Nāgārjuna makes. And what I want to point out here, just from a philosophical point of view, is that that's just one verse of the text, right? I just read you verse 5 of chapter 18 of Nāgārjuna's Mūlamadhyamakakārikā. And there's just so much. It's such a rich piece of philosophy. And for my money, I've always been intrigued by the core central role that prapancha comes to play for the Madhyamakas, and the way that conditions their understanding of the relationship between the emptiness of the self and the emptiness of the world and our possibilities for liberation. For my money, I do see them as kind of philosophical quietists, because really, in order to let prapancha come to rest, you have to stop projecting. You have to stop talking. You have to let go, and not just let go of your attachments to the world, but you have to let go of your attachments to the categories that you have used to interpret the world and through which you have constructed an identity. And in order to truly realize that for yourself, you have to go quiet. And the cessation of prapancha is also the cessation of thought, really. And that makes Madhyamaka philosophy a really profound and interesting opportunity for us to think about the limits of reasoning and the way in which reason can function to help itself come to rest. So I hope that was interesting for you. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. And if anyone has any questions or concerns or wants to hear more about Nāgārjuna, let me know in the comments. And I hope everyone is staying happy and healthy, and that I'll hear from you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.